Hi, my name is Rachel Brewster, and welcome to my podcast or YouTube channel, Humor in Heels, where we're going to talk about all the greatest stories ever told. And I wasn't really anticipating that I would start with history because it's not something that I'm like deeply embedded in, but I started reading this book, this bibliography, Catherine the Great, A Portrait of a Woman by Robert Massie, and I was so interested and captivated by it that I wanted to tell someone and talk about it, and so I'm telling you. And we already did a part one because this book is thick. It's 600 pages, and I was like, there's no way that I'm gonna recap for you what happened in 600 pages, so I split it in half because the author, wisely, spends about half of the book talking about who is Catherine the Great, where is she born, and who cares about her, and her rise and ascension to power until she becomes the Tsar of Russia, which was fascinating and captivating and incredibly well written. And the back half of the book, the last 300 pages, are really what she does with her power when she's on the throne. So if you are listening to this and watching this and you have not heard my part one of Catherine the Great and you want to know about her rise and ascension into power, you should go back and listen to or watch that. But if you didn't, I'm going to do my best at the beginning of this to give like a 5-minute recap of what that ascension was like. Now, 5 minutes might be a little bit dramatic because I think my video on part one is 50 minutes. So condensing it into 5, I will try my best, but I'm going to be giving you like the Cliff Notes version of who Catherine the Great was when she was born and how she went from Germany to Russia to the Tsar of Russia, right? Like that's a wild trip. So I'll do about 5 minutes of that, but then I want to spend the vast majority of our time together today talking about part 2, which is what did she do once she was in power? Russia had many czars, many emperors and empresses. Why is she called Catherine the Great? What made her great? That's what I'm going to focus on. I also am going to try to challenge myself to sorry, I got distracted. I'm going to challenge myself to add timestamps. So if you've already watched part 1, you should be able to use the timestamps to jump into part 2. And I'm hoping to also divide up part 2 into a couple of different categories because part 1 was really easy to follow her ascension into power. It was like a storyline in my mind versus when she's actually in power, I feel like I kind of need to have like mental categories because she did this over here and that over there and this over there, which makes sense. It's just a little bit harder to tell that story. So long story short, I'm gonna do timestamps and categories, and the categories that I'm kind of thinking of are going to be like the Enlightenment, which is a large portion of why she's called Catherine the Great. Number 2, ascension into the throne, or succession. There's the word. Succession into the throne. So who followed Catherine the Great and why does that matter, and like political pieces. And then the third thing that I want to talk about are her lovers. She had many lovers, and I just find that fascinating and very like Days of Our Lives. Okay, so here is my best attempt at telling the story of Catherine the Great in 5 minutes flat. Ready? Let's see if I make it. Once upon a time, there was a girl who was born to a small German country, and she was a princess, but a very small and easily ignored princess. Her name was Sophie. She later became named Catherine, so we're going to call her Catherine. And Catherine was born a Germanic princess with an extremely ambitious mother. Separately, and on the other side of the world, there was Empress Elizabeth of Russia. And for reasons that are unimportant to the abridged version of this story, Empress Elizabeth never married and thus didn't have any children. But Empress Elizabeth did have an older sister, Anne. And many years ago, Anne had gotten married and moved west to Europe with her husband, where they had Anne's son, Peter. So Peter is Elizabeth's nephew. Anne has passed away. Elizabeth is on the throne. She needs an heir. And she says, dibs. I'm going to bring my nephew, Peter, to Russia. I'm going to name him as my successor, as my heir, and he will be my heir. And then the throne will be secure. The lineage will be secure. We're going to be good to go. Total side note, and it does become important later in the story, in Russia at this time, you had to name your successor. It wasn't necessarily down to bloodline. So not only did Elizabeth need to grab her nephew, she also named him as her heir. Not important, super, but like side note because it comes up later. Cool, little Easter egg. So everybody's happy. Elizabeth is like, great, I've got this heir. His name is Peter. He's a young boy. He's probably like 8, 10, somewhere in that range. And so she meets him for the first time in Russia. Everything should be hunky-dory and we're all happy, right? Oopsies. Elizabeth meets Peter and is like, oh my God, what has gone wrong in this boy's soul and brain? He is, to be blunt about it, not handsome, not intelligent, not socially aware. In fact, the things that this guy says throughout his life make you just cringe and want to implode. It's so uncomfortable. And on top of that, Peter has been raised in Europe and he believes that Russia is primitive and barbaric. He doesn't want to learn the language. He doesn't want to learn the religion. He doesn't want to honor the culture of the fatherland, which he is going to inherit. And Elizabeth is like, oh my God, what are we going to do? This is not what I signed up for. This is not what I thought would happen. And Empress Elizabeth tries really hard to change Peter's heart, mind, and soul and gives him all the best tutors that are available. And to be honest, Peter's not interested, right? Like even as a kid, he's very stubborn, he's petulant, he's annoying. And to be frank with you, that never changes. I think he dies at the ripe old age of 35. And even as an adult male, what he loves most to do with his time is to play with dolls in his bedroom. That's the man/boy that Elizabeth has chosen unwittingly to be her heir. And so Elizabeth, being a intelligent empress, is like, oh no, I need a plan B. Please, Lord, little baby Jesus, help me. What are we going to do? And so Elizabeth, in her cunning and strategy and critical thinking skills, goes, aha, I know what I will do. I will marry Peter to a woman and they will have a baby and then I will name that child as my heir. That's what we'll do. Problem solved. But now Empress Elizabeth is in need of a young woman, right? And what do we know about Catherine's mom? She's very ambitious. So Joanna brings Catherine, her daughter, to Russia. Empress Elizabeth says, yes, this will work, good enough. Peter and Catherine get married, and they're supposed to create an heir. However, in order to create a baby, I don't know if you know this, but you need to have the relations, okay? You need to do the smooshy smoosh and the kissy kiss and some lovey-dovey. And that never happens. Quite literally, for at least 7, maybe 9 years, Peter and Catherine do not have the relations. Now, if you want to know why they never have the relations, you're going to have to go back and watch part 1, where I go into depth about why that would be. But for the abridged version, we're just going to skip over all of that. Long story short, I want you to imagine that you are Empress Elizabeth. You have named Peter as your heir. You have discovered, oops, that's not going to work. Okay, plan B, I'm going to marry him to Catherine and they're going to be having a baby. Can you imagine can't remember if it's 7 or 9, years later, you still don't have a grandchild? The clock is ticking, let's go here, people. So Elizabeth is putting a lot of pressure on Catherine to have this darn child. And I just said that Elizabeth wanted a grandchild, but technically Peter is her nephew, so I don't know what that would be. Second nephew? Second cousin? I'm not sure, but you get the idea, right? For all intents and purposes, a grandchild. So Elizabeth eventually takes a lover, and the lover gets her pregnant. But Peter claims that it's his, and Elizabeth knows better, but goes along with it because she needs an heir. So Catherine and Peter have a son, and I'm using air quotes around like, sure, it's theirs, wink. And Catherine and Peter have a son named Paul. Great. Elizabeth passes away, but Peter is still heir to the throne, not Paul. Paul is an infant, right? Paul is, I think, 2 at this time. So Peter ascends to the throne, and Catherine is his empress. And he ascends to the throne. This is the mid-1700s, and so at this time, I think both Peter and Catherine are like 35. Catherine came to Russia when she was like 17, somewhere around there. Anyway, it's December, mid-1700s. Peter rises to the throne and comes into power. And based on everything I've told you, do you think that that goes well? Spoiler alert, it does not. For the next 6 months, Peter makes mistake after mistake after mistake. Remember, this is the man who does not love the fatherland, does not respect the language or the culture or the traditions. So he offends the Orthodox Church, the people, and Russia's own army. Generally speaking, it's not a great idea to piss off the people with guns. But I don't know if you've ever heard the phrase, if your enemy is making mistakes, don't interrupt them. That's what Catherine does. She just sits on the sideline and she's like, you go, Peter, you go. Good luck with all of that, right? And then Peter takes a trip with his mistress to go visit his friend, the King of Prussia, without having gone through the ceremony of coronation, an official coronation, and without putting any safeguards in to ensure that his position on the throne is secure. He just leaves the country thinking, I don't know what, that like everybody's just gonna play nice, right? So the minute he leaves Moscow, Catherine and all of her political supporters put her on the throne. She takes over power, and then they capture Peter so that he can't quite leave the country. And the thought process is that they would want to render him harmless, meaning put him out to pasture, let him live a happy life, but never let him, he'd basically be a political prisoner within his own country, right? He ends up passing away instead. Oopsie. Not really sure if it was premeditated murder or if it was a total accident. Either way, Catherine didn't intend that for it to happen, but that's what happens, right? So now we've gone from this little Germanic princess originally named Sophie to her traveling east to Russia, getting engaged to Peter, this weirdo, to Elizabeth passing away and Peter, her husband, taking the throne, to whoopsie daisy, we're actually going to put Catherine's butt in that seat instead. Thank you very much. And Catherine is now the Tsar of Russia. And that's what happens in the very first 300 pages of this story. It is her rise to power. That's everything that was covered in part 1. I promised you that I would do that in 5 minutes or less. It looks like I'm closer to bordering on 10, but not bad, right? Not bad. So let's move on to part 2. Why does Catherine, the Tsar of Russia, become Catherine the Great? What makes her so great? And I want to cover 3 things. I might have already said this. The Enlightenment, Paul, her son, who's going to become heir to the throne, and also her lovers, because there was a lot of like days of our lives, like lovers in here, which I was very entertained by. Okay, so first of all, let's talk about the Enlightenment. So you may have heard about that, you heard that word before. And before the era of Enlightenment, people believed that monarchies were best, that who was born to sit on the throne was like, it was divined by God, right? And there was a lot of deep religious belief, deep superstition. If you think of like the medieval era and the thought process around who gets power and why, that was prior to the Enlightenment. What Catherine read a lot of as she was growing up and as she was lonely and bored in her marriage to Peter, what gave her solace and comfort was reading. And she read a lot of Enlightenment philosophers who said we should criticize authority, which was like a new concept, right? And we should be suspicious of authority, and we should undermine authority, and we should really not be looking at a monarchy, but we should be thinking about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And if that rings a bell for you, it's because that thought process was happening in the United States as well, right? This is the mid-1700s, the story I'm telling. And so this thought process, the Enlightenment, is spreading both East and West. And in the East, Catherine of Russia really reveres the Enlightenment and does believe that people should be encouraged and emboldened to find their own destiny. They should be free, right? And I use the word free very specifically because while Russia didn't technically have slaves, they did have serfs, right? Which are basically slaves. If you think about like a lord owns some land, serfs are peasants who are born to that land and are thus property, not humans, but property of the landowner and can be sold or worked. Men in particular who work in the mines are treated just terribly. You can beat them, you can sell them, you can, how do I say this politically correct? Or not, I don't want to be politically correct, but like, you can be unkind to their women in the worst way you can be unkind to a woman. I don't know if I'm allowed to say that word on YouTube, which is why I'm being like cagey about it. Anyway, very dark. There were definitely a lot of chapters in the back half of the book that painted a picture of what Russia was like at that time, what a lot of countries and places were like at that time, and that it was widely accepted, right? Catherine, on the other hand, because she believes in these Enlightenment philosophers, knows that there's a different way, a way of looking at the world outside of tradition and superstition, but instead look at it from logic and human reasoning. And she wants to free the serfs. And she does everything in her power to be able to do so, but she discovers very quickly upon coming on the throne that there are restrictions to even her power as the Empress of Russia. And you may think, how could that possibly be, Rachel? Great question, so glad you asked. Here's the thing, the nobles and the lords and the counts and whoever else, the nobility, the noble class, are the ones who helped put her on the throne. They're the ones who support her. And if you think about it, her grasp on the throne and on power is really quite weak and is only in the minds of the people and the noble class, because who is supposed to be in power? Peter. Why? Because Elizabeth named him. Who is supposed to be Peter's successor? His son, Paul. Notice how Catherine's name did not come up in that string. It went Elizabeth, Peter, Paul, no Catherine. If anything, what should have happened is that Paul should be on the throne, even as an infant, and Catherine would be there as mother regent, right? Until he reaches his majority, until he reaches 18 and he can be in power on his own. That is how that's supposed to happen. But then that would have, Catherine's not going to do that. She's not going to just like magically give up power to her infant son. No, right? She has taken the throne for herself and been supported by the vast majority of people. But she needs to be able to hold on to that power because her son and heir is also her biggest challenge to the throne. So she can only go so far with how she can push the nobility and the noble class about freeing the serfs. And why don't the nobility want to free the serfs? Well, for the same reason that landowners in America didn't want to free the slaves. It's where they get their money and their power. Same situation in Russia, even though it's serfs rather than slaves, right? The noble class is like, you want us to do what now? Like, that would be like, I don't know, the way that they view it would be like this pillow, this couch that I can sell and abuse, whoopsies, as I see fit and brings me money. You want to free that? Like what? No, pass. You know what I mean? So she tries really hard. She puts forward this, I don't know if you call it a referendum, but by the time it goes through the Senate and noble people have seen it, it's chopped down to like 1/4 of what she wants it to be. And she tries multiple times and she's never able to push it. And so you also have to remember that she's about 100 years ahead of her time. This is the mid 1700s. The serfs are eventually freed in the mid 1800s, 100 years later. She is 100 years ahead of her time. But without her making that baby step in the mid 1700s, then there wasn't, like, somebody has to start the ball rolling, right? Somebody's got to start pushing that forward or even bringing that idea to light, right? So this is part of the reason that we call her the Great. And BT dubs, super interesting fact that Robert Massie, our author, points out, the Tsar of Russia freed their slaves in, I want to say like 1860 something. And it was 3 years before America, we freed our slaves. So Russia freed their serfs 3 years before America freed their slaves. And I just find it interesting that that idea spread, planted roots, grew, flourished, and came to fruition all around the same time, all across the globe. Now I say flourished, but like people obviously died for this idea, right? In America, we had a civil war over it. I don't know if you've heard. And so Catherine is very much ahead of her time in this way. And I'm gonna put a pin in that serfdom conversation to just take a quick tangent that's related to the Enlightenment, and I wanna make sure that I hit it. With the Enlightenment, she created hospitals across Russia. And I want you to think about that. And again, the author does a good job of painting a picture of just how dark, barren, brutal this time period was, where hospitals didn't even exist. And she created schools, colleges, universities. She reduced the power and wealth of the Orthodox Church by pointing out how obscenely wealthy they were in comparison to the average layman. And that was a stroke of brilliance and achievement, that she was able to take some of their power and money away from them without causing a complete revolt and creating too many enemies. Really brilliant. Additional point about the Enlightenment is that she bought a ton of art from Europe, to the point that the monarchs in Europe took notice of, hey, I thought Russia was like this backwoods primitive country, and here they are appreciating and investing in the arts. And there was even a little bit of a scandal because she bought a significant amount of art from, and I can't remember off the top of my head, I want to say Sweden, for like pennies on the dollar. And Europe was stunned that and offended that this great work of art, and by work of art I don't mean one specific painting, but a bunch of paintings, would go to Russia of all places, when it's like the heart and soul of Europe. And also there was some commentary that a lot of the houses and buildings in Russia were built with wood. And so like one fire and all of that beautiful artwork would be poof, gone in smoke and lost to history, right? So there was a lot of upset and grumbling about that. But from Catherine and the Enlightenment point of view, the appreciation of art, the investment in education, the removing of obscene amounts of wealth for the church, the investment in hospitals and medicine, like these are the things that are seeds from the fruit of her earlier life, reading about the Enlightenment and truly believing in the philosophy of the Enlightenment. Art and beauty and logic and reason. Okay, that was a little tangent that I wanted to take before I came back to the serfs. So Catherine is on the throne and she tries to make headway because she believes in the Enlightenment in order to free the serfs. She puts out this huge memorandum. By the time it goes through the Senate and the nobility, it's cut down to like 1/4, and she's kind of cranky about it, but she can only do so much. And hey, it's a baby step in the right direction, right? Many years later in her reign, there is an uprising from mostly the serfs. And frankly, you can't blame them, because they're like, what's going to happen if we do an uprising? People are going to kill me. I'm basically dead already, right? Working in these mines, like I'd rather be dead. Like being beaten constantly, being violated constantly, being able to be sold as property. What is the point, right? And so there's a lot of oppression. And so they rise up against the oppression. And the guy who's leading the charge claims that he is Peter, Catherine's husband. Everybody knows that Catherine's husband, Peter, is dead and this guy is an imposter, but at the time, the serfs kind of don't care, right? They're just like, rah, and they're mad. And so there's an uprising that Catherine at first underestimates, but then she eventually, it becomes a bigger deal than she had anticipated, and she eventually is able to quell it. But who helps her quell it? The nobility, the noble class, right? So this nobility are the people who put her on the throne and swore their allegiance to her and her to them. And when the serfs have this uprising with the imposter, Peter, she thinks two things. One, I'm right about this serfdom being a problem, because if too many people are treated unjustly, they will flip the table, right? So I'm right about it being a problem, but the people who came to my rescue once again are the noble class. So like, what do we do, right? And so she's kind of met with like the difference between an idea of something and a philosophy and the boots on the ground reality of it. And you can criticize her for her treatment of the uprising and what she learned from it, all that stuff. I'm just telling you what happened, right? And remember, this is over a 35-year reign, and I can't remember when the uprising happened. But then we're at the end of her reign, closer to her twilight years, and she reigns for like 35 years. Well, what happens towards the end of her reign is all the way to the west, the French Revolution, which you wouldn't think would impact Russia or Catherine, but it does, so hold tight. So now I'm going to speak a little bit out of turn because I can't remember if it's King Louis the 15th or the 16th, but whichever, the one with Marie Antoinette, the people, the French people, capture the monarchy, and then begins this dark and terrible time in French history where they are constantly beheading people. I believe Robert Massie said that the guillotine was slicing about 50 heads per day, right? And obviously the other monarchies in Europe are trying to come in and help, but they also have their other wars going on, yada, 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 yada. It's dark and brutal and violent and deadly, right? It has a very big upheaval in France. So why and how does this impact Catherine, Empress of Russia? She looks at the French uprising and she knows or wonders if part of the reason that everything got so extreme and that the French peasants took over the monarchy, kidnapped them, captured them, and then killed them is because of the Enlightenment philosophy. Because the Enlightenment philosophy taught people or encouraged people to question authority, to question monarchies and whether it really was their divine power and right to rule. That was a piece of the Enlightenment, which spread to both Russia and to Europe, including France. And so Catherine, for all of her belief in freedom and the Enlightenment, she also does very firmly believe in the monarchy, right? She never once was like, I'm going to give up my throne, or I'm going to give up my power to Paul, or whatever. She does believe in the monarchy. She does also believe in the Enlightenment, in art and science and education and hospitals and freeing the serfs. But a piece of the Enlightenment is about upsetting her power and her seat. And she sees what's happening in France and she's like, oh, hell no. That's not going to happen in Russia over my dead body, literally, figuratively, hysterically. I'm making a joke here if you get it. So it's just interesting over 35 years, we all obviously change and grow, and what happens in the world impacts us and makes us think about things differently. So Catherine, at the very beginning of her reign, when she got her butt on the seat of power, was like, let's free these serfs. And then she's like, oh, I'm getting some resistance from the nobility who gave me this power and is letting me keep this power, so I can't push this too far. Okay. And then like a decade or two later, there's this uprising with Peter the Imposter and the serfs, and she's like, ah, shit, it is a problem, but also the nobility is helping me with that problem. Ooh, okay. And then at the end of her life, at the end of her 35-year reign, she looks at what happens when monarchs aren't in power and the bloodshed that comes with it, and the darkness that's in France. And so that kind of like changes her perspective. Now, she doesn't do anything about it, right? She doesn't like crack down on the serfs even more. It's just an interesting commentary about like how she thinks about things. That is not all, well, obviously you should free the serfs. She's like, oh shit, if we free the serfs, like everything goes into an uproar. And, you know, she loved the Enlightenment growing up and into her 20s and 30s and probably 40s. But as she got into her later years, saw that there were pieces of the Enlightenment that she wasn't as confident in, right? I, as somebody who was reading the book, wanted her to be a perfect person that was always on the side of good and always wanted to free the serfs. But the reality is that she is a human being and a monarch with incredible power and wants to keep that power. And she's a complicated human who wasn't perfect always, especially the way that we retroactively look at history and be like, you should have done things differently. You should have freed the serfs immediately. Okay? So yeah, I just found that complicated and interesting. All right, so I told you I was going to talk about the Enlightenment, which means art and hospitals and freedom and rationality and restricting some of the rights and wealth of the church, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So she's bringing the Enlightenment to Russia. The next thing that I wanted to talk about is her son, Paul, right? Who is supposedly her child via Peter, but historians know that that is not accurate. And frankly, even Empress Elizabeth was like, there's no way that that's, that's my blood, but we're just gonna roll with it, right? So when Catherine initially comes to power, her son Paul is an infant. I think he's 2, but obviously he grows up. And as he grows up, he and his mother have a complicated relationship because Catherine didn't raise him. Elizabeth did, right? So when Paul was born, Elizabeth was like, dibs, this guy's gonna eventually be my heir, and so I'm gonna like raise him as a child. So, and then she passed away. So Paul didn't really have a maternal bond or relationship with Catherine and vice versa. And then the relationship is complicated even more by the fact that yes, he's heir to the throne, but he should also be on the throne right now, right? And so part of Catherine wanted to educate him and teach him how to be a strong, wise, and benevolent ruler as she was trying to be. But the other part of her was like, but I don't want you to get it too much, otherwise you're gonna take it from me, right? So they had this like push-pull through all of their lives between the two of them, mother and son. Eventually, Paul married a woman named Wilhelmina, but similar to how Catherine was born Sophie and changed her name to Catherine, Wilhelmina changed her name to Natalia. And Natalia had a baby, but the baby died in childbirth, and so did the mother. That was much more common in the 1700s to die in childbirth. And later, when an autopsy was performed, it was discovered that Natalia, like the child's shoulders were 8 inches and her spacing ability, I don't know what the right word is here, was like 4 inches. So she never would have been able to bring a child into this world. And so unfortunately, devastatingly, Natalia and the baby passed away. I don't think that Natalia and Paul were super liked each other. No, wait, that's not right. Paul was infatuated with Natalia, but Natalia was infatuated with Paul's best friend, whose name I'm trying to remember. It was like Alex or Alexei or something. Let's call him Alex. And so we're not really sure that Natalia's child, who passed away, as did she in childbirth, is actually Paul's child. It's much more likely that it was his best friend's child with Natalia. And the reason that this popped into mind as I'm talking to you is because when Natalia passed away, at first, Paul was absolutely devastated to have lost not only his child, but his wife. Catherine was a little bit of a cruel bitch because she was like, Paul, I need you to get married and have a baby now. And it didn't work out with Natalia, so we need you to get married to a different broad and fast. And so the way that, but Paul was devastated. He was in all of his grief, right? And so what Catherine did was she snooped in Natalia's desk and in her bedroom and found letters between Natalia and Alex and brought them to Paul and was like, your wife was unfaithful and in love with another man. Are you over your grief now? Fuck. And Paul was like, yep. And so Paul married very quickly after Natalia passed away. Like, I think it was a matter of months. He married a woman named Sophia, but in following the tradition of getting a name changed when you move to Russia, she changed her name to Maria. And Paul and Maria actually had a wonderful and loving marriage. They had 9 children, 4 of which were boys. The first boy was Alexander. The second boy was Constantine, for whom Constantinople is in honor of. And the third was Nicholas the First. There was a 4th boy, but I don't remember his name, and he was younger than Nicholas and doesn't come into this story. So when Catherine was very, very old and getting close to dying, she was considering naming Paul's first son, Alexander, as her successor and heir, rather than letting Paul take it over. And she was waffling between the two. Do I do my son or do I my grandson? Son or grandson? Son or grandson? I don't know. And honestly, she just passed away before she made that decision. So Peter ended up taking over the throne. Now you may ask, why didn't Catherine want Peter? I said Peter, sorry. The son's name is Paul. Why did Catherine not want Paul on the throne? I don't know. Like, they had a pretty complicated relationship. I don't know how much she trusted him. And I think that there's more complexity to it than that. But sue me, it was a 600-page book and I can't remember quite that level of detail. But eventually, Catherine did pass. Then Peter took over. Alexander took over. Sorry, I've said Peter twice now. Catherine passed away. Her son Paul took over the throne. When Paul passed away, Alexander took over the throne. When Alexander passed, he didn't have any children and had not named an heir. No. When Paul was on the throne, he changed the law so that you don't name your successor. It is your lineage, right? And he did that because he's like, ugh, my mom, Catherine, like, she went back and forth of whether it was going to be me or my son. And I'm just like, that it shouldn't be that way. It should just be lineage, right? Okay. So Paul takes over the throne after Catherine, then Paul passes away, Alexander takes over the throne, and then hypothetically it would go to Alexander's son, but Alexander doesn't have any sons, so it reverts to Constantine, his brother, who's also Paul's son, but he's Paul's second son after Alexander, right? Constantine. However, I looked this up on Wikipedia. Constantine is a scary motherfucker. Holy shit. I'm gonna have nightmares for like a week Do not read his Wikipedia page. He is brutal and violent, and especially to women. So his first wife got the hell out of Dodge. And eventually they separated and divorced, and he remarried to a Polish woman because at the time Constantine was like governing Poland. And so I think he met her there. She was a countess. And so he married a Polish woman, but in doing so, he had to abdicate his ability to take over the Russian throne. I can't remember why. Maybe it's because like divorce wasn't allowed in Russia, but he divorced his first wife and married this second Polish wife. I'm not really sure why, but very long story short, who ends up coming to power instead is Nicholas, right? So we've gone from Catherine to Paul, from Paul to son number 1, Alexander. Theoretically, it could have gone to son number 2, Constantine, but he abdicated the Russian throne. And thus, it went to Paul's son number 3, Nicholas. Now, I had to look this up because I was like, Nicholas, didn't Nicholas marry Alexandra, and that's how he got Princess Anastasia, right, from the Disney movie with Rasputin, and like her whole family is killed, but we think that she got away, and so like Anastasia. No, I was wrong. It's not. So this Nicholas is Nicholas number 1, and then it goes through a couple of generations before it's Nicholas number 2, and it's Nicholas number 2 that gets married to Alexandra, and one of their kids is Princess Anastasia. And when the royal family is taken out, there's a rumor that Anastasia escaped, and like Rasputin comes in during that era. So anyway, little tidbit that wasn't in the book. I looked it up on Wikipedia because I was like, isn't that how Anastasia comes in? No, answer is no. All right, so we have covered the Enlightenment with art, hospitals, education, serfdom, etc. We have covered lineage from Catherine to Paul to Alexander to Constantine to Nicholas. A couple of generations later, there's Nicholas number 2, and he has Princess Anastasia, like the Disney princess, Disney movie. And there was a third thing that I wanted to talk about. Oh yes, her lovers. Catherine the Great's lovers. She had 12. She lived to be like 70, so like 12's a decent number. Like, it's a little bit scandalous, but like in Russia at the time, it was kind of just like understood and cool. So let's rewind time a little bit and talk about her lovers. So lover number 1 is when she was married to Peter, and Empress Elizabeth was like, get on it, give me a grandchild. And so Catherine ended up sleeping with this guy. His name was like Sergei or something. And he really liked that he had to like chase after her and get her and work really hard to get her. And then once he had her, he was kind of bored of her. Like, he liked the danger and the chase, right? Like, he can have sex with Catherine, but nobody can find out or whatever. And then she was pregnant with Paul, claiming that it's Peter's, but she's in love with lover number 1. And lover number 1 is kind of like over her, and he takes this post back in Europe. And so he leaves her and he goes to Europe, and she's like, no, my love. And he's like, yeah, I'll miss you too. Not, right? So she spends some time like pining after him and like wanting him to come back to Russia. And then she finally comes to the realization that this guy is just a player. Like, he is just a player. He never really cared about her, which is really unfortunate because like nobody loved her. Peter didn't love her. Even Empress Elizabeth was like very controlling. But anyway, lover number 1 is how she gets her son Paul, even though she claims it's from her husband Peter, and he does her a solid and claims the same thing because Elizabeth needs an heir, right? Lover number 2 comes into the picture, and with him she has a baby girl who lives until for 18 months and then passes away. Remember, death and pregnancy was very dangerous at the time, so infant death was common. And then lover number 3, she had a baby boy with, and I can't remember what happens to him. He never comes up again in her story, in her lineage. So I don't know if he passes or what, but lover number 3 is very important. And I keep calling them lover number 3 because I can't remember their names. I think he's like Olvo or something. That's his last name. Anyway, lover number 3 is very important because she is genuinely in love with him, right? Like lover number 1 was kind of more like lustful. Lover number 2 was just, if I'm remembering correctly, like kind of convenience and maybe a rebound. Can't remember. But lover number 3, Olvo, or I don't know how to pronounce his name. I don't remember his name. Close enough. Lover number 3 comes from a very prominent and military family. Prominent's the wrong word. He really is kind of a rags to riches situation. He is one of those underdogs who's just gonna make his way in the world, and she thinks that's sexy, and I don't blame her. So lover number 3 works his way on rising to power, and when he becomes her lover, she also helps him on that path by making him like a general and a lieutenant and giving him all of these like awards and accolades and things. But the reason that I say that he's important is, number 1, she was genuinely in love with him, not just lust and not just convenience, but she loved him. He was smart and intellectual and funny and charming and like powerful in his own way. And so she really loved him. But the other reason that he is exceptionally important is because he played a key role, and his family and his brothers played a key role in getting her on the throne, right? So lover number 3, she was genuinely emotionally attached to, and he helped her get on the throne. But once she was on the throne, she was playing that very delicate balance that we talked about earlier in the podcast/YouTube video where, okay, I have power, but it's a very uncertain power where I have to be careful and I have to hold on to it and I can't make enemies, right? And so she's playing this very delicate game and playing nice with everybody, and she's very politically savvy, very careful. And in the meantime, lover number 3, who has helped her put on the throne, becomes unbelievably jealous, right? And he just has this Russian passion and energy and machismo, if you can use that word for a Russian man, of like, he wants to be her husband. He doesn't want to be Catherine the Great's like side piece. He wants to be her husband. He wants to have power. He wants his own power. He doesn't want power because a woman is giving it to him, right? So he has a lot of like outbursts. And she's like, oh, I need you to not have these outbursts because I'm playing a very delicate game here. And there are a lot of people who really respect lover number 3, but the Russian people across the board would be very upset if this know-nothing who started from nothing, right? And there's a perception today that starting from nothing and climbing is heroic. At this time, it's like, no, you are born lowly, you stay lowly. So the idea that lover number 3 would start with nothing, climb his way up, and then marry the Empress of Russia, fuck no, right? So lover number 3 kind of pushes his luck and tries to become husband. And Catherine even considers it because he did do a lot for her and she genuinely loves him and she thinks he's intelligent and wise and strategic. She considers it. But it's made very clear to her that that would be political suicide. And eventually, lover number 3 realizes the same thing. And so they break up after, I don't know how many years, 3, 4, somewhere in that range. And she's sad and disheartened, and she takes lover number 4, who, to be totally honest with you, is a complete rebound. Sweet guy, but total rebound. He has nothing to offer her in the way of intellect, which is something that she really connects with people on. It's important to her. She's driven and working every day. She wants to come home to somebody who she can actually talk to, and this is not that guy. And he knows it. He knows it. He's very sweet, but he is well aware that he is not up to her caliber. And so he does not last very long. Lover 4 is a flash in the pan. She's always very kind to her lovers when they leave her, when they part ways. She always gives them gifts and castles and things and sends them on their way and says, I love you very much. Good luck in life. Which is very dignified of her, to be honest with you. Because some of them leave her and some of her, and some she leaves them sometimes, and sometimes they leave her. And so the fact that she handles that with dignity, I think, is very impressive and speaks to her character. Anyway, so we're moving on to lover number 5. Lover number 5 has a name that I cannot pronounce. But lover number 5 is also a man, interestingly, of like passion, right? Where he's like hot and cold. And she is drawn to that like a moth to the flame, because I'm drawing parallels between lover number 3 and lover number 5. They are very similar, right? Lover number 3 that put her on the throne had a lot of that like zest, energy, vitality, passion. Lover number 5 is almost the exact same way, and she is deeply connected to him. That seems to be something that she needs. There's some yin yang thing there. And at first she really enjoys his passion, and there's this like teenage angst of like, no, my lover, like, don't be jealous. This person was just talking to me. They didn't overstep. I love you and only you. How could you say such things to me? Right? Of like trying to get back into his good graces, right? In that roller coaster of emotion. But as time progresses, she becomes very weary of that emotion of just like, dude, get it the fuck together. Stop being such a jealous brat and be an adult. I'm with you and only you, and you can tell, right? Like, I'm in love with you. Just believe me. Let's operate together as a team. It becomes quite draining. However, why I also bring up lover number 5 as being very important is because historians suppose that he may have actually been her husband. Dun, dun, dun. So there are a bunch of reasons for this. In particular, over the span of her life and these 12 in total lovers, she will call them in her letters, my lover, my friend, my dearest confidant, little nicknames, da 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 da, but she never, ever, ever calls them my husband, my dearest husband, my companion, right? And in her letters to lover number 5, she does refer to him in Russian or French or whatever language she's writing in as her husband. As far as I know, no documentation exists, but there is, he writes about a page about like, we can't know that it happened, but it probably happened, and here's the way that it would have happened. And somebody also goes to, remember Empress Elizabeth? She also supposedly had a secret husband, if I'm remembering that correctly. But when somebody came to him and said, like, is this possible? He took out a piece of paper that could have been the marriage certificate and threw it in the fire. And so we'll never know about that history. I might be remembering, that might not be Empress Elizabeth. I think it was. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Long story short, lover number 5 is probably Catherine's husband. And he's a man of a lot of passion and a lot of strategic thinking. Eventually, she tires of him, but they both deeply respect one another. She sends him to Turkey, and he colonizes that region in part because she wants access to the Black Sea. And he does amazing work there, and they love and respect each other until they both eventually pass away. Which again, I'm kind of like stunned that she has all of these relationships and she's so graceful with them. And like think about how many breakups or divorces end in absolute flames. This woman has 12 significant relationships, different levels of significance, right? But they all end smoothly, gracefully, peacefully. That is wild and impressive. And she's the common denominator. You know what I mean? Like she's got to be the one that makes that all fluid and happen. She does have one lover who betrays her and sleeps with another woman, but he's in love with that woman, and he and the woman come to her and say, "We're in love, will you bless this union?" And she is caught off guard at first, but in her usual tact and decorum says, "Yes, c'est la vie, and I bless you, love you, good luck." Anyway, so some lovers are just lust, some are genuine love and devotion, and some are flash in the pan rebounds, right? Very entertaining. So that's it. That is the story of Catherine the Great and why she was great, the Enlightenment, her succession and lineage, and some of her lovers along the way. And that is how a small Germanic princess went from relative obscurity to being engaged to and then married to the heir of Russia, but flipped the script and became the Tsar, Catherine the Empress of Russia. And now how she's gone from being Catherine the Empress to Catherine the Great. And why she's great is because of what she did for Russia and the motherland, like hospitals, education, the Enlightenment, moving the needle for freeing the serfs, bringing art and light to Russia. Well, that was a much longer story than I had originally planned and anticipated, but I thought that you enjoyed hearing it as much as I enjoyed telling it. I will admit I am not a historian, but I am a storyteller. A friend of mine was like, "How do you remember all of this?" And I'm like, "I have no idea. I don't know. I read it, I understood it, and I repeated it." Anyway, I hope that you enjoy it, and I hope that you will stick around for the next story. If you would like to hear the next story, whatever it is, whether it's history or real life or just something fun, light, and easy, then please like, subscribe, and comment so you can get more of me in your feed. I'll see you next time. Ciao for now.